Hello, hello, good morning. So this is our last day on the Taupo volcanic zone in the southern end. We're near Ruapeo in Ohakuni, is that right?
Yep.
That's how you say it. And we're just having a morning coffee before we depart. John is going back to Wellington and I'm going to Auckland to the airport. But I wanted to pick John's brain because there's something really intriguing here in the area. Usually we have a lot of basalt in volcanic provinces and less andesite and not a lot of rhyolite, only a few percent of the overall igneous rock volume. But here in this area it's very different. We have a lot of rhyolite, a fair bit of andesite and very little basalt. John, tell me, what's the secret?
Yeah, well, that has been an ongoing secret for 50 or so years, maybe more. Let me just tell you a few little bits beforehand.
Oh, thank you very much. The coffee is just arriving.
Thanks, Miguel. Thank you.
Thanks.
Let me tell you a few things just by way of historical points. When I got the job at Victoria University in 1979, I came here in mid-April 1980, and one of the first things that the then head of department, in fact the person who actually built geology at Victoria as a discipline, Professor Bob Clark, who himself had done his PhD thesis in London with none other than Arthur Holmes.
Oh, whoa.
And actually did it in Edinburgh when Arthur Holmes was based in Edinburgh. But anyway, Bob Clark was a very astute operator in the academic political sense, and also from the perspective of how he used his various staff members. So when I arrived from Australia, he said to me quite clearly, Jim Cole and I work in the Taupo volcanic zone. We would like you to work on interplate volcanism and possibly go to the ice to Antarctica.
Whoa.
So as a result, I spent my first, probably from 1980 until about 1985, or from 1980 until 1988 or 89, working on interplate basaltic volcanism on the subantarctic islands to the south of New Zealand, between New Zealand and Antarctica, and also in the Ross Sea embayment, which is the New Zealand sector of the Antarctic continent, notably around Ross Island and in the foothills of the Transantarctic Mountains. So I did a lot of work there for a number of years, but I was always interested in my colleagues who were working in the Taupo volcanic zone, because I could see opportunities there, largely through petrology and geochemistry, which I, to be quite honest, didn't really feel that they were really recognizing. The fact was that there were basaltic magnets there at all, and they're quite they're not abundant by volume, but they are quite widely dispersed as small scoria cones through the central part of the zone, the part that you, Val, would have visited on your Congress field trips. And these are small events, but the very fact that they're there tells us that the mantle must be involved in some ways. You don't generate basalts with high magnesium olivines in them by melting crust, full stop. Some people probably think otherwise, but that was my starting point. And so as a result, I got an interest in the basalts in the Taupo volcanic zone. And again, we had a really excellent geochemistry setup at Victoria at that time. We were probably one of the best XRF labs in the Southern Hemisphere. And it was, and very shortly after I arrived, we managed to acquire a new fully automated XRF spectrometer. And so we were well placed to do good high precision XRF work on rocks such as the basalts. So I started somewhat subvertively to assemble collections of the basaltic rocks. And
Without permission from the boss.
eventually, well, my second boss, who was Jim Cole heartily approved of it, and he was so Bob didn't know that at the first, in the early stages anyway, but I persisted, and eventually I wrote a few papers on the basalts of the zone, and at that time we didn't have any isotopic facilities at Victoria, and I buddied up with a long-standing good friend, Malcolm McCulloch, who was at the Australian National University. Went over and used his lab to do strontium and neodymium isotopic analysis on the basalts. And then about the same time as this, I also had, there was also an ex-PhD student who actually did his PhD on paleomagnetism at Victoria, who got a post at NIWA, the Oceanographic Institute of New Zealand. And his first employment was to work on the offshore Kermadec Arc. Most of the volcanoes on the Kermadec Arc were submarine. So he came to me and he said, "John, will you be interested in looking at all these? Most of these rocks are actually basaltic or basaltic andesites." And I said, "Oh, of course." So we got together in this and put together the stuff that I'd done in Taupo, and we started to see quite an interesting story. And as a result, this work was published in a number of papers in the likes of Journal of Volcanology and Geothermal Research between about 1990 and 1996. So that's how I got into working on subduction zone volcanism.
But John, what is the secret? What is the answer to all these rhyolites and the low volume of basalts?
Well, the question, the very fact that we get basaltic rocks in the Taupo zone tells us that the mantle in some way must be involved. Yeah. Now, in addition to that, many geothermal wells, because the central Taupo volcanic zone is quite widely exploited. There are geothermal power stations at least 2 sites in the Taupo volcanic zone, and there is abundant, as you would have seen on the field trips, abundant geothermal water around with hot springs and so on everywhere. So there's a lot of power there, and that power doesn't just come from some sort of magical source. It comes basically ultimately from the mantle. And so the idea then was that I started to get this idea that maybe everything was really fundamentally linked, and that these huge volumes of rhyolite ultimately had a link back to the basaltic magnets. Not a direct link, but some sort of link. Now, at that point in time, I left Victoria and went back to Europe for 10 years. And in that time, a lot of things changed, and ultimately in 2012, I retired in my European position because the rules of the time dictated that I had to retire when I hit the boundary age of 65. I was an old bastard, and therefore unnecessarily taking up some young person's job. And so, because all our family live in New Zealand, my wife and I decided we'll come back to New Zealand again. And so, yes, we came back again, and very fortunately, there was a vacancy in Victoria, and Victoria actually came and asked me if I would like a position, a half-time position. And so they gave me a position, which ultimately, for 4 years, on half-time salary, and I took that up, and then at the end of that, they made me an emeritus professor. And so now a lot of work has been done by much younger people, but I'm hanging around, getting in the way, giving ideas where I can, and so on, and keeping people sane. And It's a group led by Professor Colin Wilson, and he has some outstanding young scientists in that group, working in geochemistry, petrology, physical volcanology, geophysics, and so I'm sort of tagged on with this group, and now the focus is on the sort of how these magma chambers assembled themselves in the crust and how they became unstable, and the time scales, because our dating is so much better now, the time scales in which these events take place. So that's where I am, Val. And
that's a fascinating story, John. I'm still going to poke you a little further, because I still feel we haven't kind of addressed the issue how the rhyolites came about. Because, I mean, isotopically, they are not mantle-like, right?
No, absolutely not.
So, isotopically, they are crustal, fact, aren't they?
Well, they are crustal. The isotope systems, especially new lead isotope data, tell you that the crust must be involved.
Yes.
And there's no doubt about that. But there are people that want us to have rather more complicated
this is why I'm asking, because the standard Bowen reaction series that most geology students are familiar with, which would determine that we have nodes of basalt, very little rhyolite, it doesn't apply here. That's the key issue, isn't it?
It doesn't apply here, no. There's involvement, yes, of basalts, but there is, the Taupo zone is a zone of crustal extension. It's extending at, in some places, about 20 millimeters per year.
Yeah.
And that is a racing car speed by any sort of geo standards, and so with this extension, you get what replaces the crust? Well, the upwelling mantle replaces the crust, and that upwelling mantle influx
from heat below. Yeah. Yes.
And so we have this great heat engine underneath, like several Bunsen burners, several million Bunsen burners under the crust as the crust is extending, applying heat. And so these magma chambers take time to assemble, though. You know, time scales not in tens of years, but in mostly in thousands, tens of thousands of years.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's crustal recycling, crustal melting in a way, isn't it? So that really kind of is the answer, and this is why we are completely opposed, or why we have the completely opposite end of the spectrum when it comes to Bowen's reaction series.
Yeah, but you know, there's always time for fractionation.
Of course, I mean, it's not going away. It's just that
we've seen ourselves some in the last couple of days, some rather primitive andesites, high magnesium ones with very magnesium olivines in them, and you know, you don't have to go too far to make those.
Absolutely. So no, but my key issue was the volume issue, because if we just had fractional crystallization, the volume distribution would be fundamentally
that would be
so, yeah. Well, thanks everybody, and I hope you found this interesting. A little story on research history as well as the origin of rhyolites in the TVZ. And I'm going to say thanks, John.
Thanks.
And I close
safe
here
home.
now. Yes, safe trip home. All the best.